Welcome to our Curious Amalgam, the weekly podcast brought to you by the Antitrust Law section of the American Bar Association. Our Curious Amalgam explores the fascinating and increasingly overlapping world of competition, consumer protection, data protection, and privacy law. Each week, we bring you leading global experts on the most compelling issues of the day. Enjoy the show.
Hello, and welcome to our Curious Amalgam. My name is Alicia Downey, and the title of today's episode is How is Gender Relevant to Competition Law? The OECD's Gender Inclusive Competition Toolkit. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, or OECD, is an international intergovernmental organization of 38 countries, including the US, Canada, various EU member states, and other key jurisdictions around the world. For many years, the OECD's ongoing work has included the study of ways in which competition law and policy can effectively contribute to the advancement of fair and efficient markets. In this episode, our Curious Amalgam host, Matthew Hall, interviews one of the authors of the OECD's recently published Gender Inclusive Competition Toolkit, which we'll hear about in great detail in the next half hour. Hello, Matthew.
Hello, Alicia.
Matthew, would you please introduce our guest and kick off the discussion?
Thank you. Our guest today is Lynn Robertson. Lynn is a competition expert at the OECD's Competition Policy Division within the Directorate for Financial and Enterprise Affairs, based in Paris. She's responsible for the OECD Global Forum on Competition, the OECD IDB Latin American and Caribbean Competition Forum, and managing the OECD Competition Division's relations with non-OECD countries. As you mentioned, Alicia, she was jointly responsible for preparing the OECD's Gender Inclusive Competition Toolkit, which was published in September 2023, and which we will be discussing today. Hello, Lynn, and thank you for coming on.
Hello, Matthew. Hello, Alicia, and thank you very much for inviting me.
Well, let's look at some background first, please, Lynn. The toolkit, as I mentioned, was published in September 2023, but the work started some time ago. When was that, and what was the rationale for that start of the work?
You know, Matthew, before I start, I do want to give a shout out to my other co-authors of the report. I really have to say thank you to Nadia Vassos at the ACCC, Ellen Creighton at the Canadian Competition Bureau, and my colleague Carolina Bate, because it really was a joint effort amongst the four of us to produce this final toolkit. When did we start? We started it back in 2018, pre-COVID. And Canada came to us and said, look, we have to apply gender to our work. This is now a government policy. The whole GBA Plus Canadian government is applying a gender lens to all policy areas, all departments. In order for us to get our budget, we have to show how we're going to apply gender lens. But we don't know how to do it. We've never looked at this question of gender and competition before, so we're turning to the OECD Competition Committee to help us on this question. And I have to say that our chair of the Competition Committee, Frédéric Génie, who everybody in competition knows, one of his charms is how open he is to exploring these new topics. So he immediately said, yes, let's do a hearing at the Global Forum on Competition in 2018. And here I have to give another shout out, which is to Chris Pike and Estefania Santa Cruz Vasu. Chris no longer is with us. It's a great loss. But Chris and Estefania wrote that first seminal paper that really underpins all of the work we did since 2018. So we had that first hearing at the Global Forum in 2018, and we had many delegations scratching their head. And really what they were saying is, what has gender got to do with competition? But we had enough of a response where they thought, there might be something in this. And then thanks to Ellen, she came back to us, said, look, I've got funding to explore this work further. we lacked data. We lacked evidence. We lacked data. And Sally Hubbard had done a bit of work looking at monopolies, but there really wasn't very much around. And thanks to Ellen, we got the funding to launch really a research project that could develop the data and evidence. Because as you know, the OECD, we always want to be evidence-based. We're not opinion-based, we're evidence-based. So 2019, we launched a call for papers. And honestly, we were very, very surprised by the response. We really just expected to get a very small number on a limited number of topics. So we were really surprised we had over 60 from all over the world. These were research proposals all over the world, from lawyers, from research institutes, from people in agencies, from universities. Really, we had such a variety, and the pity was that we could only choose, I think, 7 or 8 of them. And sometimes I wish that those other 50, somebody could provide the funding to take up those topics and explore them. We wanted to have a mix. We wanted to have a mix that dealt with as many competition topics as possible, and in particular that provided the data, could develop data and evidence, and could result in practical advice for competition authorities, but also others in the competition world, like private practitioners. So again, I have to apologize to those researchers and their proposals that we didn't take. Just we couldn't fit it in, and maybe one day we might be able to work with them again. So that's what developed the basis for our toolkit. From there, the researchers produce the papers that are all available online. Nadia did the first cut through the papers of finding the gems, finding that those pieces of evidence, those pieces of practical advice that could form the basis of the toolkit. And then from there, we wrote the toolkit, and that's how it came about, and we finally launched it. Our first launch was in Mexico. It was COFECE's 10th anniversary, and in September, and that was our first launch.
Well, that's great, and it's good to hear that you confirm all competition lawyers should be evidence-based, because that's what we, of course, try to do. And you referred to the gems. I think it's probably possible to very briefly outline how the toolkit is ultimately structured. It seems to boil down, or you use the word in the toolkit, distill down to particular insights. And from that, there seem to be 10 or so key findings. All of this, I should say, as I understand it, aimed principally at competition authorities, but of course, therefore relevant to practitioners as well. Is that a good way of outlining how this work kind of boils down?
I think you've done well summarizing it. Our perspective was that competition authorities are short on resources. They're short on time, they're short on staff, they're short on money. And what we have seen in our committee, when somebody goes to an authority and says, we now want you to look at another factor, we see the eye roll, because already every authority is short on resources, and every authority staff person is already overworked. So we thought, if we're going to make this toolkit something that could be taken up, it needs to be a quick reference, it needs to be practical, it needs to be to the point. And we thought, well, if somebody is interested, they could go look at the papers online, they could go themselves to find more information. But if somebody wants to open a cartel investigation, if somebody is looking at a merger, we want them to be able to open up the toolkit and says, what do I need to know about gender and merger? And they can go directly to that point. And if they want to have a bit more, we do provide the rationale in the toolkit in a very synthesized manner about why gender and merger review and market definition, but in a way which is very synthesized, as I said, and very easy to read. So the toolkit opens with key insights, which are 10 ones, boom, 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 provide some rationale in each of the topics, and then we have a checklist. This is what you need to do, tick, 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 and it can be printed out and put up your wall. The starting point was that gender might not always be relevant, but just to stop for a moment and ask yourself the question, and then you can deep dive into the checklist, which is relevant for you, look at the rationale a bit to understand, and if you're really interested, go onto the website and find the relevant papers.
As you say, there seem to be various levels of this. There are nice one-page handouts for the insights. and the findings. There's the paper, the toolkit itself, and then there's the much more detailed research papers. So, as you say, you can keep digging, I think. Before we move on to look at some of the key insights, which at least to me seemed particularly interesting for the practitioners, there is this concept which appears of gendered analysis coming from, I understand, originally the European Institute for Gender Equality. I wanted to ask you what that means. And also, it just seemed this whole analysis seems to be based on men/women. So a pretty binary, analysis. And I wanted to pick you up on that issue as well. Is that really the best way of approaching this, or is that kind of done for simplicity?
That's a very good question. And there are many different analytical frameworks when we look at gender. The ILO, DFID, USAID, Finland, Harvard, there's the Capacity and Vulnerabilities Framework, there's the Equality and Empowerment Longueuil Framework. There's many, many different frameworks. But I agree with you. I think the European Institute for Gender Equality and the European Commission has a very workable definition for gender analysis. And they define it as being the study of the differences in the conditions, the needs, the participation rates, access to resources, development, control of assets, and so forth, between men and women in their assigned gender roles. So this gender analysis, it aims to identify and address gender inequalities by recognizing the differences. Now, in the toolkit, we did not specify what constitutes a man nor what constitutes a woman. So it's really a matter of self-identification. We did consider this question often and about how we would footnote it. We recognize that gender can, as Canada states on its website, gender can be a continuum, it can be fluid, and it can change. So what we wanted was for people to self-identify. We were not providing that definition. We also recognize that much as this applies to this idea of gender, a lot of the principles could apply, in fact, to any sort of defined group, whether that's the elderly, whether it is economically disadvantaged individuals. We had to, for the sake of simplicity, we used more of a classical definition of men and women, and that's what the researchers did, because it did allow for homogeny of definition across all of the research papers, which allowed us then to cross-reference and bring together much better the points that came out of the research papers. But it was something we did debate and we were very conscious of.
Okay, that's helpful background. And I think it's interesting you make reference to perhaps further work on elderly or economically disadvantaged, which, as you indicate, could have similar points to look at. I'd like very briefly, before we move on to the key findings, which at least for me seems to contain the most relevant material for practitioners, although, as we've said, the toolkit is aimed at competition authorities. I wanted to look at some of the key insights underlying that. And I noticed in particular the documents refer to this work being primarily relevant in end consumer markets. Can you just explain what you were finding there?
Yeah, and this one I probably will point to the paper by Oxera. Oxera, what they did for their paper was they re-looked at the surveys that they had run for many of their clients. And the surveys they had were consumer market ones. It was TV broadcasting, there was insurance, there was a merger between retailers. And what they did was they went back to their results and said, okay, if we were to apply a gender analysis, a gender lens to these results, would it change our recommendations? And if we looked at, rather than this homogenous group of consumers, whether or not this merger between retailers would make a difference, what happens if we just disaggregate the data to see how women act and how men act? And they did find that within these consumer markets, men and women did behave differently. In some cases, and I think it's the TV broadcasting, the end result would not have changed their recommendation, but they did find that there was men and women did act differently. But also what they found was that the the way they designed the survey made a difference. For example, I think it was the TV broadcasting one. Oftentimes women might reply, I don't know. So they realized that in order to get good disaggregated data, they had to be more careful with the way the questions were asked. So in terms of being able to get data, they found that through the consumer markets, they were able to get better data to be able to disaggregate to see how men and women would act differently in the markets.
Okay, so it sounds like possibly on that one, although the reference is, or the comment is that this analysis is more relevant where products are offered to end consumers, it may be that there also are impacts, if you like, elsewhere in a supply chain, just that you didn't really have the material or weren't looking particularly at that.
Yeah, we were limited on what we could do. If ever we can get the funding to do a second round, it would be very interesting, especially if we could focus on digital, the way information is gathered, because web scraping and what's collected, I think there's a whole field there, a whole playground of information that could really help us to understand better how competition and gender are related.
Yeah, the insights also comment that the effects may not be immediately obvious. In other words, they may be hidden, these gendered issues. And also then refers to what was interesting for me, and we'll get onto this when we look at the key findings, I think, that this may have therefore, or that other issues to look at are the specific impact on remedies in cases, and also merger analysis and collusions. These are all in the key insights. So the key insights lead to as we discussed at the beginning, Lynn, the key findings for competition authorities, and also as I think are also therefore relevant for practitioners. And I've just picked up on a few of these which I'd like to ask you about. And also, as we'll see, these follow on from the key insights we just mentioned. The first one I noticed was the use of data and the best way to gather data in order for competition authorities to do their work in this area. What are some of the key points that you would like to highlight from that particular key finding on data?
So we picked up a few things on data. One was definitely on survey design, to be able to have some sort of identifiers for gender, to also work with some gender experts, the way the questions are designed, because sometimes women might have more of a tendency to say, I don't know. So to really think about how each question is actually designed, to find ways to have a gender identifier in it so that data can be disaggregated. And it's fundamental to have disaggregated data to really be able to see whether or not women are going to act the same way in a market as men would. And again, I go back to the Alcera paper because they really went back through hundreds and hundreds of surveys. They managed to put gender identifiers onto the responses, and they really saw different behaviors of women and men in, for example, packaged holidays markets, in TV sports broadcasting. And so it does make a difference the way the surveys are defined. We also looked at things like web scraping, because there are ways to go across the web to scrape data to see whether or not men and women are responding differently within certain markets to what they're purchasing and why. So there's different ways to collect the data, but you have to bear in mind to have something as an identifier to be able to disaggregate the data. So we emphasize a lot the importance of disaggregated data.
Yeah, so I think the message there for us on the practitioner side is yet another factor to think about when you're designing your surveys and collecting your data. Make sure it's kind of set up properly at the outset if we're trying to present something to the regulator and collecting the data for that.
Yeah, and I would say that I would soften, rather than saying yet another thing to think about, more to think about that you're going to get better quality data. So rather than this aggregate lump of data, which gives you just a generalized response of consumers in a market, you'll get much, much more specific data, which would allow for a much more tailored remedy or response.
Absolutely. Some of the key insights also looked specifically at the issue, as we mentioned, of merger analysis, and the effects not being obvious, and therefore requiring further investigation of market definition and competitive effects. That was an interesting section in the key findings, I thought. In particular, market definition and competitive effects, looking at supply side and demand side factors, and those types of issues which could be impacted by gender differentiation. Are there any specific points there that you would want to highlight?
Yeah, this was, for us, this was really one of the gems. I'd say it's one of the diamonds in the toolkit. And here we break down and we provide a checklist that can guide the authority, the staff person who is trying to define a market and is undertaking the analysis, to guide them through the questions and the things to think about. So we asked really to become much more specific, to look at, so if we're looking at supply side factors, we ask them to consider the product attributes because, we know sometimes the blue and the pink can make a difference. We ask them to look at product marketing, to consider the brand aesthetics, the packaging, how is the product sold, what are the channels being used, where is the location of the store, because this makes a difference to men and women as well. And so underneath these suggestions of what to look at is the checklist for you, and you can go through and go, yep, did I look at the specific features of the product? Did I look at brand aesthetics? Did I look in where and how the products are sold? And then we also, at the same time, will lead the reader through the demand side factors. Consider the gender of the consumers. Is the majority of the consumers or those making the purchase decision, are they of one gender or another? The behavior of consumers, consumers exhibit different behaviors along gender lines, so different elasticities of demand. And again, that leads down to the checklist, where you say, are the majority of the consumers women? Yes or no? Are there differences in behavior along gender lines, in brand loyalty or no? So again, we look at these things and we guide the authority staff to look at them to help them with their market definition and competitive effects analysis beyond just a generalized analysis. And when I presented the toolkit, or rather the project, last year to a meeting of the Asia Pacific Competition Authority heads, and afterwards, the head of the Philippines authority, he was new, came to me and he said, we did a market definition of grocery stores, but now I realize we're going to have to rethink this because there's a 4-lane highway separating the grocery stores. And we considered grocery stores on both sides of this highway, but now I realize that women, especially women with babies, are never going to run across this 4-lane highway, but a man would run across the 4-lane highway. So what is the market, the retailers for the women? They're going to be the ones that are all on the same side of the road, whereas for the men, they're willing to risk their lives, which tells you something about these men, to go to the grocery store on the other side of the road. That's the kind of thinking that we're looking for competition authorities to develop.
That's a really interesting practical example and local market definition, I guess. And certainly our Curious Amalgam wouldn't advise the men to run over that road, I think, to get to go to the different store. I think just finishing up on the findings, very interesting analysis, I thought, of the issues around cartels and collusion, and presumably the greater or maybe lesser likelihood of men to collude when they're in all-male environments, for example, I think is what is being looked at there. And that's also relevant, I think, to compliance and advocacy. So in those areas, what were the key messages that you think came out?
This is a section that we think would be very interesting to private practitioners when they are discussing with their clients. We know that men and women are very similar in terms of factors that predict involvement in white-collar crime, But they differ in terms of motivation and opportunity because women are often excluded from male-dominated informal networks. So our research suggests that authorities, they should really look beyond the formal work context, and they should consider informal networks where boys' clubs, as we call them, can emerge, and these boys' clubs can create bonds of trust. And we've seen this in corporate government where they talk about board diversity strengthening decision making, and board diversity can help reduce corruption. So the toolkit does draw upon these other policy areas. So, as I said, social norms, personal relationships, and peer pressure can all help to create and maintain cartels. And so, industries at risk for cartelization usually present the same characteristics of homogeneity. There's lots of social events, and there's a lot of regular interaction outside of that corporate framework. We think authorities can direct advocacy efforts to explain the risks of these informal networks and the risks of a lack of diversity amongst senior management. Now, when I talk about diversity, I'm not just saying that we need to interject a woman into senior management. It could be any sort of disruptor factor that changes what we're looking at if we're looking at senior management. So if, for example, all the senior management are coming from Ivy League schools and they're all white male, there's a certain homogeneity. But if you interject in that perhaps somebody from another nationality, perhaps somebody from another social class, then it is a disruptor, and there's less of an inherent risk that there will be a trust, immediate trust enough to create a cartel.
And there's a specific comment in the toolkit, which you alluded to, which is firms that opt to change representatives and pay attention to gender balances may be able to reduce the risk of cartel behavior. I thought that was an interesting specific compliance comment, which I think...
It is, and that's something we pulled out of corporate governance and anti-corruption work here at the OECD, where they've done gender work as well. We sometimes wondered as we were batting around this idea, what happens if all of the senior management across the industry were women? Would there be the cartelization because of the homogeneity of a woman-dominated network? Or whether or not there's less cartels caught that are led by women because women are just better at cartelization than men are. So there's a lot of research to be done on cartels.
Thank you, Lynn. So just finally, before we move to our end segment, could you please tell us what the OECD is looking at or thinking about in terms of future work in this area, or indeed similar areas? You mentioned a number of other research ideas in addition to the 7 papers, but is there anything specific we should be looking out for here?
We often discuss this, especially with Ellen, because Ellen is really actively implementing the toolkit in the Canadian Competition Bureau, and she has a lot of lessons coming out of her experience of the toolkit there. You know, much for us, of course, is going to depend on funding. But one of the things we had asked the researchers when they gave us their papers was to give us a bit of a future path. So the analysis group, who wrote an excellent paper, they suggested that beyond merger analysis and the framework that they outlined in their paper, they thought it could be applied to other antitrust analysis, such as the estimation of damages in cartel cases. When we asked the researchers to deliver the papers to us, we also asked them to give us ideas for future work. And analysis group suggested that perhaps this framework, we could see how it could be applied to the estimation of damages in cartel cases. And I think that's something that could be very interesting to explore. I know Canada would be keen on some sort of benchmarking, that if an authority doesn't regularly apply a gender lens, how much better is their analysis? How much better are their outcomes? We're saying you will get better outcomes, but we need the evidence and the data behind it. Also would be looking at, I would really personally very much like to look at, and South Africa recently came out with an excellent paper on anti-competitive barriers that women entrepreneurs face entering into the market. I would love to do more work on this, and it's something that Chris and Estefania had alluded to in that very first paper about regulatory barriers allowing women to enter the market. I would also be interested to see more case studies, really to beef up the toolkit with practical examples. And finally, one last point that we're playing around with a bit is to see how we can integrate this concept of a gender lens in competition at the teaching phase. So for students of competition economics or students of competition law, start to get them thinking about gender or other groups, this differentiation at that stage of their learning.
Thank you very much, Lynn. And I think we will now go to our final segment, and I'll ask Alicia to take that on, please.
Thank you, Matthew. Yes, before we let you go, Lynn, a couple of notes for our listeners. First, the toolkit itself, which is a very concise, easy-to-read document. We'll be posting a link to that on the web page for this episode. There, and then within that, you should be able to find, if you click on that link, you'll find the web page for the toolkit with links to the papers, which, as Lynn has said, just have a wealth of information. So I encourage listeners to go and grab that toolkit as quickly as possible and I think you'll find it very interesting. One thing we like to do with all of our guests here on our Curious Amalgam is to find out a little bit more about them as people. So, Lynn, the first question we want to ask is, what's something interesting about yourself that is outside of your professional life?
I think actually that's the hardest question of this podcast, and I was trying to think how to reply. So within my division here, competition, I'm known as being the sports person, one of the sports person, because I do a lot of sports, and particularly I do long distance triathlon. But I think what's even more interesting about me is that I'm particularly interested in science fiction, British science fiction written in the 50s and 60s. And there's an absolutely fantastic wealth of this literature, and it gives a sense of what society was in Britain in the 50s and 60s, what values they held and what values they felt would be at risk. So I spend a lot of time trying to track down these obscure books. And then I'm going to use my privilege as a guest and say one other type of literature I particularly like too is books produced by Persephone Books. Persephone is a publishing house located in Bath, England. And they publish women's literature from the early 20th century. And they're detectives hunting and seeking down literature that's gone out of print. So, and those books I find absolutely fascinating. So I think if you're looking for something else that I do aside from competition, it's reading obscure literature.
Oh, I like that. One more thing that we're going to do before we let you go is we're going to play a little game we call the Curious Hat.
And now it's time for the Curious Hat!
The rules of the game could not be any simpler. Matthew will draw a random surprise question from a completely virtual, non-existent hat. And so take it away, Matthew.
Well, I'm choosing my random question, and as it happens, my random question is, what book are you reading right now, Lynn? And what do you think of it?
Oh, well chosen.
Oh, gosh. Okay, so I am reading a book called On Sexism, The Cost of Sexism. And it discusses how much sexism costs to economy and society. But it's really fascinating because the author doesn't just take a Western European, Anglo-Saxon, North American perspective, which I find occurs in a lot of feminist literature, but she really goes back and looks at things like property rights and her experience working in a lot of different cultures in Africa and Asia. So that's what I'm reading at the moment.
Well, it sounds fascinating and not science fiction.
No, it's not. I decided to take a little break from that as I track down my next book.
Very good. Well, thank you so much for being a wonderful guest. Again, I cannot commend the toolkit enough to listeners. Thank you, listeners. Thank you, Matthew, for conducting a wonderful interview. And tune in to our Curious Amalgam next week.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of our Curious Amalgam, a competition, consumer protection, data protection, and privacy law podcast. It is produced and shared around the globe by ABA's Antitrust Law section. The opinions expressed by the participants in this podcast are their own and do not necessarily represent their employer or other organizations. If you like what you heard or would like to become a member of the American Bar Association, please check out what the Antitrust section has to offer at ambar.org/antitrust. You can learn more about our podcast at ourcuriousamalgam.com. If you have comments, suggestions, or podcast ideas, please reach out to us at podcast@ourcuriousamalgam.com. Until next time, thank you for listening.